September 7th, 1191. Before the sun rose over the Mediterranean, 20,000 crusaders were already marching toward what many of them believed would be their graves. They stretched across 12 miles of scorched coastline, a column so thin and exposed that any competent enemy commander would see it as an invitation to slaughter. On one side, the sea offered no escape. On the other, hostile hills concealed an army that had destroyed every Christian force it had faced for 4 consecutive years. The heat arrived early and without mercy. By sunrise, temperatures climbed past 110 degrees. Knights sealed inside 80 pounds of steel began to cook alive in their own armor. Sweat pooled beneath chainmail, turning every step into torture. Horses collapsed every few hundred yards, legs snapping beneath the weight of riders who could not dismount fast enough to save them. Those who lost their mounts faced an impossible choice: keep walking on blistered feet beneath crushing armor, or die where they stood. Some did both. Every mile south from Acre carried the army deeper into Saladin's design. The Sultan's scouts shadowed the column from the hills, always visible, never reachable. Signal fires bloomed across the ridges each night, confirming what the Crusaders already knew. Every movement they made was being observed, measured, and counted. Richard the Lionheart rode at the center of the formation, his royal banner flying high enough to be seen for miles. It made him a target, but also a promise. As long as that banner remained upright, the army marched on. The gamble defied every principle of medieval warfare. Richard had trapped himself against the coastline, stretched his army to the breaking point, and committed to a forced march through territory stripped of water and food. Any strike against the center of the column would split his army into isolated fragments unable to support one another. A message from front to rear took 2 hours to travel. At any moment, half the army could not see the other half. But Richard had no alternative. Behind him lay destroyed fortifications, burned supply depots, and coastal strongholds Saladin had methodically erased. Ahead waited Jaffa, the only port capable of sustaining a Crusader army. Without it, the Third Crusade would collapse within months, not from battle, but from hunger. Richard calculated that 5 days of forced marching could deliver his army to salvation. Saladin calculated that the march itself would destroy them. The Muslim army moving parallel through the hills numbered close to 30,000. 12,000 Turkish horse archers, 8,000 heavy cavalry, 10,000 infantry and support troops. Veterans who had broken Christian power across the Levant and reclaimed Jerusalem itself. Every morning, Crusaders woke to the distant pounding of war drums echoing from the hills. Every evening, fires signaled enemy coordination they could neither see nor disrupt. Water sources had been poisoned or destroyed. Wells produced brackish liquid that left men vomiting and weak. The heat killed more Crusaders than arrows. Scouts returned with the same report, hour after hour. The Muslim army was closing in from 3 directions. Then, on the morning of September 6th, the news changed. Saladin had moved his entire army forward. The coastal road ahead was blocked. 30,000 warriors now stood between the Crusaders and Jaffa. The trap was complete. Richard faced annihilation: either attack an enemy that outnumbered him 3-2 on open ground, or retreat through territory already crawling with enemy scouts. As dawn approached on September 7th, both armies prepared for what would decide the fate of the Third Crusade. The Crusaders marched forward anyway. When the sun finally lifted itself above the Mediterranean, the world the Crusaders saw no longer resembled a march. It was a sentence being carried out. Across the coastal plain near Arsuf, Saladin's army emerged from the early mist in perfect order, stretching from the low hills to the edge of the sea. It was not a chaotic host, not a mob driven by zeal, but a disciplined machine built for annihilation. For 4 years this army had broken every Christian force sent against it. Now it stood between the Crusaders and survival. The formation was deliberate. On elevated ground to the right, 10,000 Kurdish cavalry waited in silence, lances upright, horses trained to charge as one living wall of steel. At the center stood the Mamluks, elite slave soldiers whose loyalty and discipline were legendary. Each man represented years of training, wealth in armor and weapons, and an oath never to retreat. To the left, spreading wide across the plain, rode thousands of Turkish horse archers. Light, fast, and deadly, they were the most feared weapon of the Muslim world. Their composite bows could pierce chainmail at ranges Christian archers could only dream of. Saladin had arranged his army not to smash the Crusaders at once, but to bleed them to death. The first attack came without warning, without charge, without mercy. Drums began to pound from multiple directions, their rhythm echoing through the hills and bouncing off the sea. Horns wailed. 30,000 voices rose together, not shouting words but unleashing sound itself as a weapon. Horses reared. Men crossed themselves. Fear moved faster than any messenger. Then the arrows came. The Turkish horse archers rode in wide circles just beyond the reach of Christian bows, loosing arrow after arrow with terrifying speed. The sky darkened as shafts fell in endless waves. Shields splintered. Armor rang like bells. Horses screamed as arrows buried themselves in eyes, necks, and flanks. Men fell without ever seeing the enemy who killed them. Richard's orders were clear and brutal in their simplicity. Do not charge. Hold formation. Endure. The Crusader army moved like a wounded beast, shields locked, ranks compressed, absorbing punishment without reply. Every instinct screamed to attack, but discipline was all that stood between survival and collapse. Saladin pressed harder. Small groups of cavalry charged suddenly, forcing reactions, then wheeled away before contact. The goal was not breakthrough, it was exhaustion. The psychological pressure mounted with every minute. Knights watched enemies approach close enough to see faces, only to withdraw laughing beyond reach. The rearguard suffered the worst. Hospitaller knights, tasked with protecting the column's vulnerable end, were ground down relentlessly. Horses fell so frequently that the road behind the army became a trail of broken bodies. Men fought on foot beneath crushing armor, their strength bleeding away with every step. The heat became a second enemy. Sweat filled helmets. Vision blurred. Armor burned skin. Men collapsed simply from standing too long beneath the sun. Water was gone. Wells produced foul liquid that worsened dehydration. Messengers rode forward again and again, begging Richard for permission to charge, any charge, just to end the torment. Each time, the answer returned unchanged. Hold. Wait. Let them come to us. By late morning, arrows carpeted the ground so thickly that horses refused to step forward. Shields looked like living creatures bristling with quills. Entire units had lost half their mounts. Discipline began to crack, not from fear, but from fury. The arrow storm had reached its limit. Men were no longer thinking about survival. They were thinking about revenge. And somewhere in the rear guard, a single knight finally decided that obedience was no longer an option. The breaking point came suddenly, like a spark igniting dry tinder. Brother Baldwin of Carrillo, a Hospitaller knight, had watched his comrades fall for hours under the relentless rain of arrows. Horses screamed and collapsed. Men fought on foot, sweating blood and exhaustion in armor that had become their tomb. Obedience to Richard's orders, the same orders that had kept them alive for so long, suddenly felt like a death sentence. With a roar of fury, Baldwin spurred his warhorse forward alone, charging directly into the massed ranks of Kurdish cavalry. He did not pause, he did not calculate, he simply acted. His rage became a contagion. Other knights, witnessing the reckless bravery of one man, followed instinctively. The Hospitallers broke formation, 300 heavy cavalry surging into 10,000 enemy warriors. It should have been suicide. The odds were impossible, the enemy disciplined, their numbers overwhelming. Yet the charge struck at the precise weakness in Saladin's crescent formation. The Kurdish cavalry, spread thin along the right wing, could not concentrate sufficient force to repel the assault. Turkish horse archers, deadly at range, found their bows useless in close combat. The wedge pierced through the front line, and behind it lay nothing but supplies and camp followers. Richard watched the unfolding chaos from the center of his line. In seconds, he understood that the single reckless charge had created an opportunity, an opening that could decide the entire battle. He faced a critical decision: reinforce the unauthorized attack and risk total collapse, or hold back and allow the Hospitallers to die alone. Before he could decide, Saladin's right wing began to falter. Panic rippled outward. The disciplined Kurdish cavalry, veterans who had shattered Christian forces across the Levant, were retreating in disorder. Within moments, the psychological impact spread. Seeing one of their own charge fearlessly into certain death triggered a breakdown in cohesion. Richard's choice was made for him. He sounded 3 sharp blasts on his war horn, the prearranged signal for a controlled, coordinated charge. Knights who had endured relentless arrow fire, heat, and exhaustion now surged forward in wedge formations meticulously drilled during the march from Acre. 3,000 knights struck the Muslim center with devastating precision. Lances punched through the Mamluk elite, swords found gaps in armor, and horses plowed through the stunned enemy lines. Simultaneously, the Templar contingent attacked the left wing at the moment the Turkish archers attempted to reposition. The effect was catastrophic. Lightly armored horse archers were crushed under the weight and discipline of armored knights. Panic spread like wildfire through Saladin's army. Veteran Mamluks abandoned positions, fleeing from a situation that defied every expectation of training and discipline. The impact was immediate. 17 minutes of ferocious fighting changed the battlefield entirely. 7,000 enemy warriors lay dead. 32 commanders fell, their expertise irreplaceable. Saladin himself barely escaped capture, shielded by the remaining guards who sacrificed themselves to cover his retreat. Richard could have pursued the broken army and ended the battle decisively. But he did not. He halted the Crusader forces, restraining them from overextension. The decision was deliberate. Exhaustion, heat, and attrition had already weakened his army. Pushing too far risked annihilation or overextension in hostile territory. Even so, the battlefield resembled a scene from legend. Horses and men lay strewn across the plain. Armor gleamed in pools of sunlight and blood. The psychological shock to the Muslim forces was complete. Their reputation for invincibility was shattered. Even those who survived the initial charge fled in disorder, leaving behind supplies, banners, and weapons. The Crusaders, battered but disciplined, held their ground. Despite minimal casualties, fewer than 700, they had achieved the greatest tactical victory of the Third Crusade. The triumph was undeniable, yet the war was far from over. Jerusalem remained out of reach, and Saladin would recover, regroup, and continue the campaign through diplomacy and delay. The lesson of Arsuf endured. Even disciplined, elite forces could collapse under the shock of human fury and the precise exploitation of terrain and timing. 17 minutes of calculated chaos had preserved the Crusader army and shattered the myth of Saladin's invincibility. Yet it also reminded all involved that tactical brilliance did not guarantee strategic victory. Richard's army survived, Saladin's reputation was shaken, and the sands of Arsuf bore witness to one of history's most extraordinary reversals. 17 minutes had rewritten the narrative of the Crusades, but the fight for the Holy Land continued as the dust settled over the coastal plain. A strange silence replaced the chaos of battle. The Mediterranean sun bore down on the carnage, casting long shadows over a battlefield littered with fallen men, shattered banners, and broken horses. Vultures circled above, drawn by the scent of blood and the remnants of what had once been the most disciplined army in the Levant. The Crusaders had survived. Against impossible odds, they had turned near-certain annihilation into a tactical triumph. Less than 700 casualties among their ranks, an almost miraculous figure considering the intensity of the fighting and the relentless arrow storm they had endured. Every surviving knight, every weary soldier, had played a role in what would be remembered for centuries as one of the most extraordinary military feats of the medieval world. Saladin's army, by contrast, was shattered. What had once been 30,000 elite warriors now consisted of fewer than 8,000 effective fighters. Thousands lay dead, including 32 commanders whose experience and leadership could not be replaced. Horses lay tangled with armor, lances snapped like twigs, and banners that had once signaled the might of the Sultan's forces now floated silently in the heat, blooded and torn. Yet, for all the victory, the Crusaders did not pursue. Richard the Lionheart, understanding the delicate balance between triumph and overreach, halted his army. He restrained the knights from chasing Saladin's fleeing troops across the plain. Exhaustion, heat, and the fragility of his stretched formation warned that a reckless pursuit could destroy what remained of his army. The tactical victory was complete, but the strategic battle for the Holy Land was far from over. Richard's restraint became a lesson in discipline and foresight. The victory at Arsuf was decisive, yet it underscored a harsh truth. Battles alone could not conquer Jerusalem, nor could courage alone secure the Holy Land. The fight would continue, shaped as much by diplomacy, supplies, and endurance as by sword and lance. In the aftermath, the psychological impact on both armies was profound. The Crusaders, once on the brink of collapse, now carried renewed confidence. They had survived the impossible. They had faced the elite of the Muslim world and emerged intact, their discipline, courage, and timing vindicated. Meanwhile, the myth of Saladin's invincibility, built over years of victories, was forever diminished. Even the Sultan himself recognized the extraordinary nature of the defeat and its human cost. The coastal plain bore witness to the limitations of even the most formidable force. Numbers, training, and reputation could crumble under the right combination of human fury, calculated risk, and split-second decision-making. Arsuf proved that chaos, when exploited correctly, could become a weapon as deadly as any sword or arrow. Richard's army rested, replenished its ranks, and tended the wounded. The survivors looked across the plain, imagining the thousands who would never return home. The land itself seemed to remember the battle. The broken armor, shattered shields, and crimson sands were silent monuments to courage, despair, and the fragility of life in war. 17 minutes had rewritten history on the battlefield, yet the Third Crusade would continue without the conquest of Jerusalem. The Holy City remained beyond reach, and diplomacy, not swords, would shape the final outcomes of the campaign. Richard's tactical brilliance had preserved his army, shattered his enemy, and inspired generations, but ultimate victory in the crusade remained elusive. Arsuf became more than a battle. It became a story of human endurance, leadership, and the unpredictable forces of chance and courage. It reminded the world that even the most disciplined armies could falter under psychological pressure, and that bravery, fury, and calculated risk could overturn the expectations of centuries. As the sun set over the Mediterranean, the sands of Arsuf held the echoes of war, screams, steel, and hooves that would never be forgotten. History remembered the courage of the few, the mistakes of the many, and the fleeting nature of triumph. 17 minutes had changed the course of a single day, but the lessons of that day would endure for centuries. Victory had been won, but the war for the Holy Land, like the sands of Arsuf, would endure long beyond those who had fought upon it.